Early on the morning of January 22, 1944, an Allied amphibious force arrived in Anzio, off Italy's west coast. Under naval and air bombardment, landing craft drove toward the shore. The landings took the German forces completely by surprise. It seemed as though the Allies were about to break the stalemate in Italy. But the inevitable German response soon came, in force. The battle for Anzio turned into a bitter conflict as the Allies fought desperately to hold on to their beachhead. The Germans continually rammed against the Allied defensive perimeter. Anzio was a bloody arena where the ambitious American General Mark Clark and seasoned German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring would engage in a prolonged and agonizing clash of warriors. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill once told Stalin that the Mediterranean was the soft underbelly of the Nazi crocodile. Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff were sure that attacking German-occupied Europe through Italy would help shorten the war. But in Washington, President Roosevelt and his cabinet wanted to assault the German industrial heartland. With reluctance, he agreed to join the British on the road to Rome. In November 1942, joint Anglo-American troops mounted an invasion of French Northwest Africa. From there, the Allies advanced into Tunisia, the last bastion of the German and Italian Axis forces in North Africa. At Casablanca in January 1943, after much debate, the Allied Joint Chiefs of Staff decided that the next objective after Tunisia should be Sicily. Once Sicily was secure, they would target the Italian mainland. Normandy would be postponed until spring 1944. In early May 1943, the Allies finally secured Tunisia. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding the German forces in the Mediterranean, was certain that Italy would be the next Allied target. In July, the Allies launched the invasion of Sicily, known as Operation Husky. After some brief but hard fighting, the Allies took the island. However, the bulk of the Germans defending Sicily had escaped across the Straits of Messina into mainland Italy. The Sicilian landings brought the war onto Italian soil. The loss of the island convinced most Italians that they were fighting a losing battle. After 20 years of dictatorship, Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, was deposed on July 25th. Marshal Vittorio Emanuele Badoglio succeeded him as head of the Italian government. With Sicily conquered and Italy in turmoil, the Allies agreed to a limited campaign. They recognized that the invasion of Normandy must take priority for resources. On September 3, 1943, the Allies launched the offensive on Italy. General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army made amphibious landings on the southern toe of the country. They met little resistance and began to drive inland. 4 days later, the Italians surrendered. Kesselring swiftly moved German troops south to fill the vacuum left by the Italian forces. Meanwhile, under the codename Avalanche, Clark's U.S. Fifth Army was about to land on Salerno. This was the furthest north that the Allies believed they could guarantee maximum air support from planes based in Sicily. When the Allies landed at Salerno on September 9th, the Germans were ready and waiting. Mark Clark found himself engaged in a desperate struggle against ferocious and determined enemy resistance. At one stage, the Allies were so hard-pressed that Clark gave orders to prepare for withdrawal. But after a week, overwhelming Allied firepower finally forced Kesselring's defenders to retreat, and Salerno was secured. Within 3 weeks of the Salerno landings, Clark's Fifth Army entered Naples. While withdrawing, the Germans took maximum advantage of the numerous river lines and Italy's mountainous spine, the Apennines. By November 1943, Clark's Fifth Army was closing in on a formidable system of defenses which Kesselring had constructed in the mountains. The Allies were also confronted by the rain and high winds of the Italian winter. Montgomery's Eighth Army, battling across the eastern side of the Apennines, and Clark's Fifth Army slowly lost momentum. But it was Kesselring's Gustav Line that finally brought the Allies to a halt. By Christmas, the Allies realized that a radical solution was needed to break the impasse. They decided to outflank the German defenses by landing a force on the coast north of the Gustav Line. The success or failure of the Anzio operation would depend on the experience and professional abilities of General Mark Clark and Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Mark Wayne Clark was born in 1896, the son of a colonel in the U.S. infantry. As a boy, he was set on a military career and entered the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1913. Lieutenant Clark graduated in 1917 and, like his father, was commissioned into the infantry. He served with the American Expeditionary Force on the Western Front, but in autumn 1918, he was seriously wounded while leading his battalion in an attack against a strong German position in the Vosges Mountains in southeast France. After World War I, Clark served in both infantry command and staff appointments. After graduating from the Army War College in 1936, he was operations officer for the 3rd Infantry Division at Fort Lewis, where he impressed George C. Marshall, the future chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. However, Clark's progress was held back by the slow promotion system in the U.S. Army during peacetime. His fortunes changed dramatically thanks to the patronage of General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Army Chief of Staff George Marshall. Promoted to lieutenant colonel in August 1940, Clark helped plan and run the Louisiana Army maneuvers, which would shape the U.S. Army for World War II. By 1942, he was a major general and given a key role for the Allied landings in Northwest Africa that November. Clark was to secretly negotiate with Vichy French leaders to ensure that the landings were unopposed. This entailed a landing by a British submarine on an Algerian beach. The French agreed to only token resistance. Clark was rewarded with promotion and at age 46 became the youngest three-star general in the U.S. Army. Soon afterward, Clark was appointed to head the newly formed U.S. Fifth Army, the first major field command of his career. Now, at the end of 1943, Clark was determined to break into the Gustav Line. Albert Kesselring was born in Bavaria in 1885 to a middle-class family. He was commissioned into a Bavarian artillery regiment in 1906. Kesselring served with distinction in World War I on both the Western and Eastern fronts. By the end of 1917, he was a captain on the German Army Headquarters operations staff. With the support of General Hans von Seeckt, head of the German Army in the 1920s, Kesselring moved up. After serving as a training instructor and staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Kesselring was posted to Army headquarters in Berlin. Hitler noted his innovative approach to the air-to-ground cooperation, vital to many aspects of blitzkrieg tactics. As a result, Kesselring was promoted to Major General in 1935 and transferred to the Luftwaffe. He commanded the 1st Air Fleet during the Polish and Norwegian campaigns at the beginning of World War II. He then led the 2nd Air Fleet for the invasion of France in May 1940. Kesselring continued to command the 2nd Air Fleet during the Battle of Britain. Hitler made him commander-in-chief of the German forces in the Mediterranean and responsible for North Africa. Here, Kesselring frequently clashed with Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary commander of the Afrika Korps. Subsequently, Hitler gave Kesselring responsibility for Italy's defense, with Erwin Rommel in charge of the north of the country. By the winter of 1943, Kesselring and Clark were facing each other across the Gustav Line. Their respective plans for the new year would be crucial to the fate of Italy and the outcome of World War II. In the summer of 1943, Hitler ordered Kesselring and Rommel to draw up a strategy for the anticipated defense of Italy. Rommel argued that they should abandon the Italian mainland in order to build a secure defense line on Germany's southern flank. Kesselring was convinced that Italy's terrain was ideal for a protracted defensive campaign. It would hold off the maximum number of Allied troops. By the winter of 1943, Kesselring prevailed and put his strategy into effect. Italy's numerous rivers and mountains were natural barriers against any swift Allied advance northward. Kesselring exploited these obstacles through the formidable Gustav Line, whose cornerstone was the dominant Monte Cassino. The Allies would have to capture this if they were to reach Rome. As soon as the Allies invaded Italy, Kesselring deployed troops to the Gustav Line. Behind the line itself, Kesselring began to establish further defenses north of Rome, the Caesar Line. Kesselring also had another potential ace up his sleeve, the Italian road and rail infrastructure, which was still intact. At Salerno, he was able to move his reserves rapidly across country to reinforce his troops where they were most hard-pressed. The men of Kesselring's Army Group C were formidable opponents, prepared and easily mobilized. The German 10th Army was led by General Heinrich von Wiedinghoff, with 150,000 men, including panzer, mechanized infantry, and parachute divisions. Kesselring also had over 120,000 troops in reserve who could be moved rapidly from the north to reinforce the Gustav Line. His one problem was that the Luftwaffe in Italy lacked the strength of the Allied air forces. His greatest advantage was the protection of the craggy hills and mountains where the Germans had established their defenses. Allied leaders worried about Kesselring's dug-in defense. It was clear that the only way to outflank Kesselring's Gustav Line would be another amphibious landing. But by now, the bulk of the amphibious shipping necessary for such a landing had been slated for Normandy and was about to leave the Mediterranean. After much debate, the Allied High Command allowed some ships to remain, but for a limited time. In early 1944, the landings would take place at Anzio, 20 miles south of Rome. The Allied plan was to be in two stages. Clark's U.S. Fifth Army, supported by Montgomery's British Eighth Army to the east, would assault the Gustav Line at Cassino on January 20th. This would draw Kesselring's reserves from the north before the amphibious assault on Anzio took place. The landings were scheduled for 2 days later under the codename Shingle. Clark selected Major General John Lucas and his U.S. Sixth Corps for the operation. Once his troops were ashore, Lucas was to advance toward Rome, cutting Kesselring's communications with the Gustav Line by seizing the Alban Hills southeast of the city. But Lucas's assault force was made up of less than 2 divisions. The U.S. 3rd Division, commanded by Major General Lucien K. Truscott and supported by 2 U.S. parachute battalions, would land east of Anzio and form the right sector of the beachhead. At the same time, Major General William Penny would lead part of the British 1st Division and British commandos in landings to the west of the town. The remainder of British 1st Division was to act as a floating reserve, with the U.S. 1st Armored and British 45th Divisions acting as a follow-up reserve force. Clark was satisfied that Lucas had sufficient forces for the mission. He was banking on the shock effect of the combined assaults against the strongly held Gustav Line and amphibious landings at the weakly defended Anzio coast, deep in the German rear. But Clark needed to quickly consolidate the Anzio beachhead to fully succeed. Only then could the breakout begin. Clark recognized that Allied air power would be a key factor in the operation. But he had learned some hard lessons from the recent near disaster at Salerno. Clark advised caution and patience to Lucas in building up his resources ashore, especially his artillery and mobile forces, so that he could sustain his advance inland. Clark's counsel would have a significant influence on what would transpire at Anzio. The Allies knew that Operation Shingle was a major gamble, but by early January 1944, the die was cast. As the offensive loomed, both Clark and Kesselring had no doubts that they would soon rely heavily on the experience, skill, and courage of their men. Despite their successes, the Allied troops fighting in Italy were becoming disillusioned by the end of 1943. This was not the sunny Italy portrayed by the travel posters back home. The bitter winter weather compounded the hard fighting and mounting casualties from the past 3 months. As common in war, the burden was on the infantry. One American soldier later recalled that the only way that an infantryman was going to come out of the Italian mountains was to be carried out. For many, it was actually desirable to get wounded. Over 16 different nationalities made up the Allied forces in Italy. Though the bulk of the men were from America and Britain, there were also soldiers from France and its colonies. Troops from the British Dominions made up a significant part of the 8th Army. There were also men from the occupied countries of Eastern Europe, in particular, Poland. The Allied commanders had to account for the multinational nature of their troops in their planning. Determined enemy resistance, poor weather, and the difficult terrain hardly matched Churchill's vision of a soft underbelly to the Nazi Empire. To Mark Clark and his men, Italy was becoming a tough old gut. The Allied troops did not underestimate their opponents. By early 1944, Clark's men had become fatalistic. An officer wrote, "In Italy, we would advance to a position, dig in, and just stay there. The Germans made it impossible for you to move on, and it was only when they were ready to leave that we could move forward." Though Clark was an imposing commander, the Fifth Army was unsure of his leadership. He dismissed the British concern that after over 4 years of war, they were beginning to run out of men and had to watch their resources. The American troops also saw him to be equally unconcerned about their mounting casualty toll. For all these reasons, the Allied troops preparing for Anzio were less than optimistic. On the other side of the Gustav Line, the German troops under Kesselring were used to the terrain and fighting conditions in Italy. Many of them were by now hardened veterans of many campaigns. They were not strangers to prolonged combat. With the Italians now out of the war, the Germans no longer had to worry about propping up a weaker ally. They proved their doggedness in the face of increasing odds throughout 1943 and demonstrated their natural skills in defense. They were well motivated and morale was high, especially since they had imposed heavy losses on the Allies and stalled their advance on Rome. The German troops in Italy were also well led at every level of command. Those defending the Gustav Line also knew that there were plenty of reserves behind them, which could be used to plug any gaps that appeared in the defenses. In contrast to Clark, Kesselring was highly regarded by his troops and known as Smiling Albert. They knew that his strategy of bleeding the Allies white in Italy was working. With the coming new year, both Clark and Kesselring realized that the battle about to take place would test both Allied and German strategies to their limit. The assault on the Gustav Line, the first phase of the renewed Allied offensive in Italy, was launched as planned on January 20th, 1944. At Cassino, Kesselring's defenders held the high ground and were ready for the assault. Faced with heavy German fire, the Allied attack soon began to falter. It prompted Kesselring to deploy some of his reserves to the Gustav Line. On January 22nd, while the attacks on the line continued, Clark's troops came ashore at Anzio. As the first Allied troops approached the beaches, they were anticipating a swift and bloody response. It never came. Kesselring had expected an Allied landing, but had no idea where, and he lacked the forces to defend the whole coastline. The Anzio beachhead was consolidated in an atmosphere of eerie calm. After the bitter battle at Salerno the previous September, it seemed incredible to the Allied troops that there was no instant German reaction. Within 48 hours, Lucas's U.S. 6th Corps of Clark's 5th Army had established a firm beachhead and seemed poised to launch a rapid advance. The time was ripe to drive toward the gates of Rome. But as the Anzio beachhead consolidation continued, no immediate breakout was planned. Lucas was cautious and decided to build up his supplies before striking inland. Even General Harold Alexander, the overall Allied commander, took no action. So instead of pressing inland, Lucas continued to sit in his beachhead, wasting valuable time. Meanwhile, the assaults against the Gustav Line near Cassino had ground to a bloody halt. Those who had taken part in the attacks grew weary. Back at Anzio, the buildup continued, and Clark was satisfied with the progress. An angry British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, on the other hand, told Alexander, "I thought we'd flung a wildcat into the Alban Hills, but instead we got a whale floundering on the beach." When Lucas's assault force landed on January 22nd, Kesselring had only 2 battalions and a few coastal defense batteries between Clark's Anzio force and Rome. At first, he did not believe that any reinforcements to the Anzio area could arrive in time to contain Clark's force before it broke out. Caught off balance, Kesselring typically recovered fast. Spurred on by Hitler's demand for the immediate liquidation of the Anzio abscess, he launched air attacks on the beachhead. Kesselring gave General Hans-Georg von Mackensen an improvised 14th Army, made up of a number of well-equipped and battle-hardened units to first contain Clark's invasion force and then repel them. Kesselring was preparing to hurl no less than 10 divisions, with over 200 panzers against Clark's depleted and hard-pressed forces defending the perimeter and beachhead. Between February 3rd and 10th, a series of ferocious counterattacks were launched by von Mackensen's 14th Army. They forced back the British 1st Division in the western sector and threatened to break through the 15-mile-long Anzio perimeter. Desperate battles raged around the Aprilia factory in the Padiglione Woods in the center of the Allied line. Allied advance units were overwhelmed by the weight and ferocity of the German attacks. Entire Allied units were either annihilated or became prisoners of war. Many were inexperienced and surrendered willingly to the German onslaught. It seemed as though Kesselring was about to score a major victory. Hitler believed that Anzio would be a turning point in Germany's fortunes. He promised Kesselring that the unit that broke through would have the honor of escorting Allied prisoners through the streets of Berlin. Kesselring's well-equipped and determined 14th Army redoubled their efforts. Clark realized that the Anzio beachhead could only be relieved from the south by a breakthrough at the Gustav Line and Cassino. The Allies prepared another attack at Cassino. They mistook an old Cistercian monastery on the summit of Monte Cassino as a German observation post and pounded it with heavy bombers. The resulting rubble in the abbey and the town of Cassino below provided first-class defensive positions for the Germans. This enabled them to hold off the Allied attack. Clark's troops at Anzio anxiously stood by to meet another German onslaught. With the failure of the latest Allied assault at Cassino, they knew that if they could not stop the main German counteroffensive, which was sure to follow, Anzio would be lost. On the evening of February 14, 1944, at Anzio, the situation was becoming perilous for the remnants of Clark's U.S. 6th Corps. Though reinforcements had been arriving to bolster his exhausted defenders, there was little time to consolidate before Kesselring's fresh counteroffensive began. He was certain that this time he could destroy the beachhead. Launched on February 16th, Kesselring's onslaught stretched the Allies almost to the breaking point. Even the rear areas of the beachhead came under intense and continual German bombardment. The most fearsome weapon was known as Anzio Annie, a 210-millimeter railway gun with a 500-pound shell and a range of 30 miles. It created havoc wherever the shells landed. Between February 16th and 20th, Kesselring's men continued their relentless attacks on Lucas's beleaguered 6th Corps. Clark's casualties continued to mount alarmingly. Every German attack was preceded by massive artillery bombardments. The German tanks and infantry assaulted the perimeter defenses and continually threatened to achieve a breakthrough. Though they were cut short by a heroic Allied defense, they would soon regroup and advance once more. The Allied defenses were constantly battered and were becoming dangerously thin in places. As the bitter, bloody struggle continued, Clark decided that the time had come to make a drastic change in the Allied command of the Anzio battle. On February 25th, he ordered Major General Lucien Truscott to take over command of the beachhead from Lucas. Though Truscott was a more aggressive and decisive commander than Lucas, the German pressure continued. On February 29, 1944, Kesselring launched another series of determined drives to at last break the Anzio perimeter. For 3 days, the battle raged. Casualties were heavy on both sides. As dawn broke on the third day, it seemed that the desperate attempt to hold on to Anzio would be futile. The fragile crust of the Allied defensive perimeter looked as though it was about to crumble. Kesselring pressed his men for one last decisive assault to destroy Clark's exhausted defenders once and for all. But just as the Germans appeared to be on the verge of victory, the Allies unleashed massive naval artillery and aerial bombardment on Kesselring's forces. Clark's 6th Corps was saved by these overwhelming and concentrated attacks. By the end of the day, the pride of Kesselring's 14th Army had been smashed by Allied firepower. Kesselring's offensive had been contained, but the battle was by no means over. An uneasy stalemate followed in the next 2 months. The Anzio area came to resemble a World War I battlefield. Meanwhile, Clark and Alexander were devising a new plan to finally break the German resistance at Cassino and Anzio. Under the codename Operation Strangle, the Allies carried out a systematic bombing campaign designed to destroy Kesselring's lines of communication. Bridges, roads, and railway lines were targeted, severely restricting the German ability to move their troops, weapons, and equipments into and out of the battle areas. The pause before the next offensive also enabled the ground to dry out after the spring thaw. By mid-May, though Kesselring had continued to apply pressure at Anzio, his forces were totally exhausted. Clark knew that without a breakthrough at Cassino in the south, the Allied garrison at Anzio could do nothing more than hold its line and tie down Kesselring's forces opposing them on the Alban Plain. Finally, on May 23rd, as the remainder of Clark's 5th Army broke the back of the Gustav Line at Cassino, Truscott's 6th Corps was at last able to launch its own breakout operation from Anzio. 2 days later, the Anzio and Cassino forces met. Now, Clark appeared to have an excellent opportunity to trap Kesselring's 10th Army by swinging east. But against the advice of General Alexander, the Allied Supremo in Italy, Clark decided to drive straight for Rome. On June 4, 1944, Allied troops reached the city. Clark was not far behind and entered Rome in triumph. He lost a golden opportunity to cut off Kesselring's retreating forces. The Germans withdrew and regrouped behind the Caesar Line to the north of Rome. Another frustrating stalemate and the Italian winter lay ahead, and the Allies would experience further heavy fighting against the Caesar and then Gothic lines before the German forces in Italy finally surrendered in April 1945. Anzio had been a protracted and costly campaign. The Allies had suffered 100,000 casualties. Kesselring's forces had suffered about the same. In December 1944, General Mark Clark took over the 15th Army Group in Italy from Alexander and led it until the end of the war. After the war, he commanded the U.S. occupation force in Austria. In 1952, Clark later took charge of the United Nations forces in Korea. In 1984, he died at age 88 and still remains a controversial figure. Kesselring continued to command in Italy until October 23, 1944, when he was seriously injured in a road accident. In the early part of 1945, he returned to Italy. For the final month of the war, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief West in Germany. He was arrested and tried for war crimes in 1947 and was sentenced to death. But with the personal intervention of Churchill, his sentence was retracted. Instead, he was given a life sentence in Werl, Germany, but was released through an act of clemency in 1952. Kesselring published his memoirs in 1953 and died in 1960. His reputation as one of Hitler's most able commanders has endured to this day. Anzio was an Allied gamble which very nearly became a disaster. Against resolute and skillful German attacks, the Anzio garrison was almost foiled. It was ultimately saved by the Allies' overwhelming firepower. For Mark Clark, it was a difficult and controversial victory. But for Albert Kesselring, it was a face-off in which he came close to inflicting an historic defeat.